I'd now just like to say a few words about this lecture series. We have titled this Innovation Pathways to Sustainability. So we are looking for high-profile, internationally visible speakers who can help us understand better the challenges and the potential solutions to sustainability challenges. We have had a long list of speakers in the last year. And today I'm really, really happy, Ruth, that you have made it to our lecture series. Professor Ruth DeFries is Professor of Ecology and Sustainable Development at Columbia University in New York. And she has been one of the intellectual leaders in the science communities around human-nature interactions and also land use. I in my early PhD days, read a lot about your work on land use and land use change. Actually, if you ever look at my dissertation, you will find a couple of your papers cited there. You are an elected member of the US National Academy of Sciences. You received the MacArthur Genius Award and many other honors for your scientific research and science communication work as well, including numerous bestsellers for popular audiences. I read one review of your book called The Big Ratchet: How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis by the Wall Street Journal, which emphasized the focus on innovations as pivotal elements and strategies to overcome crisis. And I guess that's also something that motivates us in this TRA to come together and think about how we can transdisciplinary work together towards that goal. Your new book is titled What Would Nature Do? And if I understand correctly, you will also tell us a bit about that book. That's why I stop here, because I don't want to spoil the story. And pass over to you, Ruth. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you all for joining. So what I like to do today is to combine a discussion about the book that Jan just mentioned and some research work. So the book is about what do we learn from nature? What strategies do we learn from nature that can help us think about how we organize ourselves and our human institutions in this time of uncertainty that we live in? The research side is motivated by my work in the study region, particular area in central India, where there is very interesting part of the world. And the part I want to bring in the research about is the food security, or rather food insecurity, and how we can perhaps use our science to address serious issues of food insecurity in this region, which is a very poor region of the country, and around the world as well. So I'm going to try to merge these sort of abstract concepts from the book and ground realities from research. So the book is focused around the idea that we live in uncertain times. We live in a complex system, and our world is unpredictable. And how can we learn to be resilient given the unpredictable world that we live in? So to make the point about the unpredictable world that we live in, I was supposed to be with you in person last March, and Jan and I were emailing back and forth about, does it make sense to cancel, or can we have this event in person? Can there be travel? We ended up canceling, which of course was the right decision, because I think pretty much exactly at the time when we were supposed to have this seminar, the lockdowns and travel restrictions went into effect. So unpredictable events happen. And then we rescheduled. We rescheduled for the following September, which seemed like that would be, of course, the pandemic would be behind us by then, and we would be able to have a seminar in person. So Hannah booked a ticket to travel to Bonn. And again, that couldn't happen. So we couldn't have predicted. Here we are. So what happened was I was supposed to give that seminar in September, and completely my fault, 100%, stupidly messed up the time zones. You know, that time of year when the time zones change and it's very confusing. So that was my mistake. So I guess it's kind of predictable that I would do something stupid like that. But again, unexpected things happen. So here we are now with this incredible event that is shaking the world with so many cases and so many deaths and the spread of the pandemic. I wrote the book before the pandemic, and then again had to introduce some ideas about the pandemic into the book after it was in its final stages. So surprises happen, and that's the world we live in. Also, in the last year, we've seen a lot. This is a very kind of American-Australian story where we've seen fires that were very severe, very damaging, and unpredictable when and where exactly those will occur, partly as a result of climate change and partly as a result of management. We've also seen in the last decade, who would have thought this? Who would have thought that this would be the cast of characters who was making such important decisions that affect billions of lives around the world? But here we are, except that now I can make that a little bit better and remind us that change does happen. But regardless of who is in power, the reality is that we live in this incredibly complex system, a complex world that is so interconnected, so intertwined, that our future is really about the cascading and ricocheting effects that happen from this interconnected world. That a virus that emerges in a town in China just travels around the world in days, and ideas travel around, and we are so interconnected, and so many feedbacks and all of the characteristics that make our human civilization fit the definition of a complex system. So in a complex system, the primary feature is the interaction among the parts, which makes for nonlinear relationships, which makes for unpredictable behavior. And that is our reality. That is our modern civilization. We don't live in the kind of world where technological fixes will be able to have silver bullet kinds of solutions. That's the kind of thinking we came out of with the 20th century. We live in this complex world. So that is our reality in the Anthropocene, that we have unpredictable feedbacks, such as how the pandemic ricocheted around the world. We have no prior experience or roadmap as a species living with this kind of interconnectedness and this kind of complexity. And while there's many benefits to this interconnected world that we live in, there's also risks of cascading and uncontrollable failures. So that was the idea behind writing this book, which, as I said, I wrote over the last 6 years or so prior to the pandemic. To think about nature. Nature is also a complex system, probably the most complex system there is. And nature, life on Earth, has persisted for billions of years through all kinds of shocks, asteroids crashing into the Earth, and extinctions and diseases and swings in climate and all kinds of shocks. And somehow life has persisted. So are there strategies that we can learn from? Not that human society is like nature. Human society has values and morals and takes care of its sick. And not that there's a perfect analogy between human civilization and nature, but are there strategies that we can learn from? So the book is organized around 4 strategies. So I'll just try to go through them quickly and weave in some ideas from our research with that my colleagues and I have done around food security. And what I was looking for when I was writing this book was positive examples where human experience through trial and error, the same way nature evolution works through trial and error, have come to these strategies that nature uses to be resilient to shocks. So the first strategy is around networks. So human civilization, as we see from that map of the world, is, and our global economy is a network where there's exchange of goods and food and ideas and finance, and networks are the basis of civilization. And networks are also the basis of nature in many ways, to move what water and sugars and nutrients around. So if you look at a leaf vein, this is a kale leaf from my garden. You can see I'm a very bad gardener. But if you look at that leaf vein, you'll see all kinds of networks that have veins that loop around. It's doesn't look like a very organized network. That these are the veins that move water throughout the leaf. And, and what the physicists have shown us is that that kind of very loopy kind of network is bringing resilience to the plant. So early ginkgo leaves, earliest trees, had a leaf vein network that was simple, that branching kind of network that you see. And later on, what evolved was this kind of very complex network and many different ways to get from point A to point B in the leaf. Just like if we're caught in a traffic jam, we want many different ways to get to our destination. So what's the benefit there? So the benefit is that that there's some safety against damage. So like this kale leaf in my garden, insects will take bites out of a leaf, or there can be a tear in a leaf. And if that happened with the kind of ginkgo kind of leaf strategy, that would cut off the supply of water to the rest of the leaf. So this kind of redundancy in networks is bringing some resilience, even though it's not particularly efficient. The plant has to invest in building the veins and the energy, the materials and energy to build those veins. So giving up some efficiency for the benefit of redundancy and resilience. So is this something that we can learn from in the way we organize all the different kinds of networks that we have in human civilization, for communications, for trade, for all kinds of networks that we depend on? So there is a story in the book about this scientist, engineer, who is a father of the internet. And he was working for or advising the Defense Department during the Cold War. And his task was to advise on what's the communications network strategy that would be resilient to an attack. So the thinking at the time was this kind of centralized strategy, more like a ginkgo leaf than a redundant network. And he was young at the time. He proposed not that centralized strategy, because his argument was, if you have an attack that takes out that central command, then your whole network is taken down. He did a lot of tests and theories about these different kinds of strategies. And what he proposed to the Defense Department was the one on the right, this distributed kind of strategy, which I'm sure he didn't think about it in terms of being like a leaf vein, but that's what it is. This idea of a loopy network where there's multiple ways to get from point A to point B anywhere in that network. So if there is an attack or damage, then the network still functions because there are alternate routes. So when Paul Barron presented this idea as a young engineer, he was laughed out of the room. He was not taken seriously at all. A few decades later, his work was unearthed, and the early founders of the prototype internet dusted off his work and used it as the basis for the internet strategy, and turns out to be the strategy that is most resilient and works. So here's an example where human trial and error over time comes to a similar strategy that nature comes to through trial and error over billions of years. So there's also, we all know about redundancy in engineering. We would probably not want to get into an airliner that didn't have redundant engines. So this is quite an accepted principle in engineering. But then let's think about some other aspects of our society. Think about the global food trade, which has evolved to be highly concentrated in a few parts of the world where cereals are produced. So North America, Russia, these few places where you see the arrows going out to many other places in the rest of the world where it's efficient and it makes sense to produce the food where it is cheapest and most productive to grow. But it has also created a non-redundant kind of network, not as centralized as the one that Paul Barron argued against, but a centralized network where a lot of people are dependent on production and distribution from a few places. So this is some work from our research led by Stephen Wood, who is now at Yale. And we were asking the question, does this trade it distributes food, it distributes tons of cereals, but does it distribute nutrients for people's diets around the world? And we went into this, at least I went into this analysis thinking that poor countries are trading away their nutrients with their, with the trade of perishables and nutrient-rich foods, and sort of subsidizing the rich parts of the world. Well, that was not true. That was not the way this analysis came out at all. That what Steve found was that with trade, the way it currently is, that there is a more equitable distribution of many different kinds of nutrients than there is without trade. So that is certainly a positive thing, that people can get nutrients, and that if we went to a world without trade, with production as it currently is, we would have less equitable between countries, the food supplies of different countries. We'd have less equitable distribution. So the idea there is that many countries are depending on a few for their dietary nutrients. So in a stable world, that seems to be a fine thing, that there can be distribution of nutrients and more people can have access to dietary nutrients. But in that analysis is very much an assumption of a static world. The real world is dynamic, as we know, and we see volatility in food prices. So is this kind of network, which is good for distributing nutrients around the world, what happens in this kind of dynamic world? Well, we know, look back on the food price spikes that occurred in 2008 and 2011, where there were some droughts and climate extremes which hit the major food producing parts of the world, which led to price spikes, but more importantly, led to the reaction of the countries, to those countries, to export, put in place export restrictions, which further increased the price spike. So here we have an example of a complex system, interacting parts, nonlinear feedbacks, and the end result being rising food prices and food riots around the world. And many people say that those food riots were part of what led to the Arab Spring. So one of the stories in the book is about, while we've learned about the importance of redundancy in networks from for the internet, for engineering, there's many aspects of our human institutions where introducing some redundancy into our networks might cost some efficiency, but might pay off in times when climate extremes or political upheavals or other unpredictable events occur. And it's certainly one of the learnings from the pandemic. Now we hear a lot people talking about introducing redundancy into supply chains. So that's one of the strategies from the book, strategies from nature that's in the book. Another strategy is not surprising at all, about diversity. Diversity is the bedrock of ecology and of nature, and increasing diversity over time. Again, that is a very well accepted idea in finance, in the idea of keeping a diversified portfolio. That any investor will tell you that, and not even a diversified in terms of the varieties, but also the types of investments. So to not put all your investments in one technology or one utility or one type of investment. So that is extremely well accepted in the finance world. But again, in the world of food systems and food security, it's been going in the other direction. So this is some of the great work from Colin Curry, who has produced so many interesting analyses on this topic. And one of his analyses is about how the diets around the world are becoming individually more diverse, but globally more homogeneous. So those kinds of crops, which were important prior to the Green Revolution, such as the traditional cereals, such as sorghum, millets, and so on, have dropped out of the diet with research focus and attention and extension around the high yielding cereals of rice and wheat, which is where the Green Revolution started. Those kinds of what are now called orphan cereals have dropped out, and other commodities have increased. So that's what these bar charts are telling us, that the crops such as soybean, palm oil, sunflower, these crops that are producing vegetable oils, where there's been such an incredible increase in consumption over the last decades, have increased in their contribution to the food supply, and these more locally based traditional cereals and other types of local crops have declined. So this kind of loss of diversity at a global scale. So this plays out, exactly this story plays out in India, where I focused my research. And if you look at the trends going back to the beginnings of the Green Revolution, we see exactly that the incredible achievement in increasing production of rice and wheat, which is amazing that the country has gone from being an importer to an exporter and producing so much cereals, just despite the increase in population, that the per capita production has increased. That is an amazing achievement. But you can see here that those are the C3, the cereals that follow the C3 photosynthetic pathway, rice and wheat, which got so much attention. And what has dropped out or become less proportionally important are the C4 cereals that are adapted through evolution for dry conditions and poor soil conditions, the sorghum, pearl millet, many different kinds of millets. So those in the Indian diet, oh, okay, so here's a picture of these C3 and C4 cereals. The C4 cereals in places where there's dry conditions and poor soils were previously much more extensive in the diet and production systems, and have dropped out. Oops, we need to do that. Okay, so we took a look at these trends, again, in terms of nutrients, not just calories. So because all of these cereals are somewhat similar in terms of their calorie content, this switch predominance of rice wheat to at the expense of these other cereals doesn't really make much of a difference. But when you start to look at the nutrients, then it makes a big difference, because the C4 cereals are generally very high in micronutrients such as iron and zinc. So this is at a national scale. If you look at the iron, this is consumptions based on consumption data. Over time, per capita, we see that from a calories point of view, okay, some changes, but from an iron point of view, and iron deficient anemia is a major public health problem, has declined over time. Now, if there was a change in the diet where other items came in to make up for that iron, loss of iron from cereals, then that would be fine. But that's not what happens in most places. There are some exceptions in some geographies in the country where diets have improved, and this is not, but this is the general story, that the iron consumption per capita has declined, and that is attributable to the loss of iron in cereals. So this problem has been most severe in for the rural poor, who depend heavily on subsidized rice through a public distribution system, which is incredibly important for food security, but distributes low nutrient content cereals. And we see this clearly in this trend where the iron consumption has declined for everybody, but most severely for the rural poor. So we put our heads together about this. A lot of people in India have been thinking about this topic. I call this the MILLET team, to try to ask the question, well, is it possible to achieve both objectives, to have enough production to feed people? That's of course essential, but also have more micronutrients such as iron produced, and how much would that, what would that mean for water? Because these C4 cereals use less water. What would it mean for greenhouse gas production? Because paddy rice produces greenhouse gases through methane. So we tried to look at multiple dimensions of this question of, just hypothetically, if the production of millets improved back to their historical extent. And this is a very complicated figure, so I won't try to go through it all. But the point is to look at what is the impact of this scenario of increasing production of these C4 cereals, the millets and the sorghum, for different dimensions: protein, iron, irrigation demand, energy demand, greenhouse gas production, and resilience to climate shocks. So the C4 cereals are more resilient to climate extremes because they are adapted to dry conditions. So to make a long story short, the bottom line is that there's mostly win-wins in optimizing for nutrition and these environmental dimensions without losing overall production or increasing crop area, which is not a possibility in India. So that's a story, you know, it's pretty well accepted now in government and the public that these C4 cereals, the millets and sorghum, are nutritious, are beneficial. The question now is not so much the science, but how to actually make that happen. Now, I say that this is sort of widely accepted, not because of our work, but because many people have been working on this. And it's so interesting to watch what is going on now, is that these wonderful cereals are now, you can go into fancy restaurants in Mumbai and Delhi, you can go into high-end grocery stores and find these cereals very beautifully packaged for a high price. I have to admit I buy them. And people recognize the value. Now, whether and how and when that availability of these cereals will make it to this ration shop in my study area remains to be seen. These are people who are getting rice from the public distribution system, and there is a lot of talk and experiments and actual work going on to try to include these to below poverty level households to achieve that objective. So that's a kind of some research results that go along with the idea of diversity and preserving and bringing back diversity in our food supply. There's two more strategies that I'm going to quickly go over because I think I've already exceeded my 30 minutes. So the third strategy, which I discuss in this book, is this idea of self-correcting feedback. And nature is full of mechanisms to achieve homeostasis and to recover before catastrophe can really cause a big problem. So we see this all throughout predator-prey dynamics, through physiology, like the way our blood sugar is regulated, through hormones, up to global scales, through the long-term carbon cycle, global carbon cycle, which regulates the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, through a temperature dependency, which has enabled life to evolve and keep climate fairly stable within bounds. Of course, it varies, but within bounds, so that we are not a runaway greenhouse effect like Venus or like Mars. It doesn't have these kinds of self-regulating features. So nature is full of these self-regulating features. And again, in the finance world has taken on this lesson through the idea of circuit breakers in the stock market. So circuit breakers, which we all saw last March when the stock market was plunging, when the pandemic hit, is the mechanism to, when there is a drop in the Dow at too high of a rate, then there is a automated halt in trading, which stabilizes the market, and then it can rebound instead of continuing down into a plunge. So these circuit breakers were put into effect by finance regulators in the after the 1987 Black Monday. And you can see here how that played out in what's known as the flash crash, which occurred in 2010. And again, in the pandemic, when these circuit breakers were tripped over and over and over again. So this lesson that nature tells us is so important to being resilient. The finance world has learned that, but in other arenas, we have not learned that so well. So the fires that have been so devastating in the Western North America and Australia and other fire-prone places are more devastating because we didn't learn this lesson, that small fires are a self-regulating mechanism that keep big fires from burning out of control because of the buildup of the fuel load. So this idea, Smokey Bear, this is a very American kind of thing, Smokey Bear, that tells everybody to put out fires and all fires are bad. This idea comes from European forestry and applied in a situation like Western North America, where the indigenous practice was to have these small fires and keep the big fires, that kept the big fires from being too devastating. We lost that mechanism, and now people are very much realizing that that kind of mechanism is so important. Just one more minute on this last strategy that's discussed in the book, which is actually my favorite chapter, which is focused around Elinor Ostrom, who is such a wonderful scholar and wonderful person, who countered the idea that we run our human societies by central command with a top-down kind of strategy. That was the idea, that top-down kind of strategy was the idea that Garrett Hardin brought to us in the very popular idea of the tragedy of the commons, that the commons will be trashed unless there are regulations and top-down control. Elinor Ostrom countered that view with many studies of water management and forestry and fisheries and community policing and many different studies she did to identify those situations where people can self-organize based on their local situation and manage their resources. She was very careful that that kind of self-emergent collective management occurs under particular conditions, and she pulled out what those conditions are. So that in nature, very much the way that nature operates, there's not really command and control from a central hub. In nature, we might think about a queen bee that is directing traffic and somehow communicating to the ants about where they should be going to form these lines that look like there is some kind of army-like command. But that's not the way nature or evolution has devised for ants to be able to march in a line. Ants are only following their very, very local information, the pheromones that the ant in front of them leaves to guide them where to go. So nature is full of, again, these kinds of examples. Termites, again, the way termite mounds get built is not central design. It's not a queen or someone at the center directing all the individuals where to go. It's this self-emergent properties of individuals following their local environment that emerges into these single formations and incredible termite mounds. Now, of course, people are not ants. We have ideas. We don't want people to decide where to go based on pheromones. People are thinking creatures. But if you think about the Paris Agreement and how countries came together, of course, we all know that the Paris Agreement is insufficient to solve the climate problem, but it was the first time in decades of countries trying to agree on reducing emissions, where countries could actually agree. And part of that success comes from the change in strategy to a more bottom-up, from a top-down kind of strategy. You're in Bonn, so you live and breathe this. For countries to bring to the table their contributions to what they can contribute to reducing emissions, as opposed to kind of previous strategies of trying to divide up the pie from a central kind of strategy and allocating emission targets. So this idea of when is it advantageous for human institutions to use these kinds of bottom-up strategies as opposed to top-down, which we also need, is something that nature tells us. So I'm to sum up, the book is about these 4 strategies, which I pulled out from nature, that have some lessons and relevance, perhaps, to the way that we navigate our future in this complex world of human civilization. And just to end with the quotes, one from the West, one from the East, that this century is different. The last century, it was all about technology and wonderful achievements and great things that happened. This century is really a lot about how we live with the complexity that we've created and have our human institutions, our leaders, and our strategies that give us resilience to the shocks that will inevitably come our way. So thank you so much, and looking forward to some discussion.
Ruth, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'm sure the book will be spreading like an uncontrolled wildfire in the Bonn communities. You hit so many buttons which we care about at CEF. Decisions from bottom up. Elinor Ostrom, who visited CEF several times, is considered by us a great scholar. Self-correction, diversity, networks, and redundancy. I think these principles and strategies which you found in nature, but also connected to economic behavior by the human communities who are also part of nature. I think this was all extremely stimulating and brilliant. Colleagues, please raise your little blue hand or write not just your comments, such as thanks and highly impressive what I'm reading here, but try to challenge Ruth with a good question.
I'm going to stop sharing. Should I stop sharing so we can?
Yeah, maybe that's easier. Then we see more of us.
Yeah.
Lisa takes the floor, or Lisa takes the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the very nice presentation, and I think it's very interesting. I was wondering, I was like you, surprised by the outcome of the redistribution of nutrients if there would not be international trade. And I was wondering if the reason for that might be that most of the countries that are exporting a lot of food, they have, they are not producing that diversity of food anymore because they are so specialized in, like Brazil and soy, for example. So if we would imagine that they would actually shift back because of this stop in trade to a more diversified production, and that this would probably change, right, the outcome of that study.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That's why, exactly, you're right. So this is the situation based on the current production, the way production has evolved. Now, if we did not have that kind of trade, would we have this kind of concentrated production and specialization? Probably not, probably not. But one aspect to think about in this benefits and disbenefits of a globalized food supply is that we could have a diversified system with diversified production in individual countries, which is great for when it works. But then when something if there's a climate extreme or some kind of impact in that country, then they would be in trouble. So there are real benefits to having this, trade and interconnection, but there's also real downsides, like you just said, specialization and countries not producing their own nutrients. So I don't have a good answer, but where's the balance in there? How to keep the benefits and, because, the world has not seen, we see horrible famines, which are conflict related and politically related, but we don't see the kinds of famines that occurred, even as recently as the 60s, because we have the ability to move things around more, move food around more. So how do we keep that kind of benefit, but organize the system so that it doesn't have the risk of cascading failures like we saw in 2008 and 2011?
Probably an optimization question. How do you optimize the share of imported food? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And having multiple trading partners.
Okay, Alicia Mazabayev.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation. I'm Alicia, I'm an agricultural economist at ZEF. I was wondering, all these three mechanisms, redundancy, diversification, self-regulation, they help us a lot with becoming more resilient to shocks. But at the same time, as you mentioned, they are reduce perhaps somewhat the efficiency, and certainly they create more transaction costs, which may ultimately end up in, say, reducing our rate of growth rates, economic growth rates, poverty reduction rates. So do you think from that perspective, application of these principles would be politically acceptable, and they would also require then a lot of redistributional policies? Or maybe there's possibilities, for example, using new technologies to cut down on this transaction cost, apply these nature's principles, but at the same time maintain all these high growth rates that we were having before. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You exactly hit on the issue. Our world is so organized around the idea of efficiency and short-term gains, and that is beneficial in many ways, but also leaves us vulnerable to these kinds of shocks. So I'm going to take the view that nature is a whole lot smarter than we are. Not that nature is intentional or by design, but nature has a whole lot more experience than we do as a human species. So going back to the example of the leaf vein, and there's work in physics about this, the structure of those leaf veins, it is a cost. Absolutely right, like you're saying, it is a cost. There is a transaction cost for building those veins to have that kind of redundancy that the plant might or might not need. So it might be a wasted cost. But evolution has, through trial and error, has landed on the strategy that it must be worth it. Otherwise, the plant wouldn't invest those costs. But the way that the plant reduces those costs is by having those veins that give all that loopiness into the network to make them very small and to minimize the investment that the plant makes in those veins that give that loopy kind of redundancy. So again, it's that balance, the balance about how do you keep the benefits, but do some kind of investments that that confer some resilience. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure very smart economists can figure out what that trade-off space looks like and what the right kind of balance is.
Okay, thank you for these answers. Ruth, I currently don't see a blue hand up. Jan, do you see any comments in the commentary? Then let me maybe step in with a little question. First of all, I'm a friend of the ginkgo tree. The
beautiful tree.
As you know, it's not only beautiful, but it has a male and a female, and thereby it gets its resilience. Anyway, nature is enormously complex. Don't you see growing complexity in human organization? Before the meeting started, I referred to the Food Systems Summit. If I look around, currently we have lots of parallel processes to deal with the food problems at international level. We have parallel processes on ocean summits, on biodiversity summits. It seems humanity is learning that we have a serious problem on our hand and have instituted parallel processes. What's your comment on what you are seeing? You seem to confront humanity against nature, and one behaves well and has functions, but I see humanity is behaving naturally in responding. So what's your comment on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you that evolution works through trial and error. And so does human experience and human civilization learns through trial and error. And when I was writing this book, I was looking for those examples of where human society has learned or through trial and error has come to these same kinds of principles. And what was so most interesting to me when I was writing this book, that most of the examples that I found came from the finance world and from engineering. And those, of course, are very critical. People care a lot about their money, and they care a lot about, you know, buildings that don't fall down. So those are such incredible, those are such important functions of society. So now I think we're learning that these are other functions, food and water and sustainability are so much of foundation for the future of our health and prosperity, that we are seeing these institutions and so much work around these, and everybody who's here, I'm sure, is working on some aspect of sustainability. And I think Elinor Ostrom, I mean, we lost her too early, she died in her 70s, wrote a lot about this polycentric governance and the importance of having a diversity of institutions at all different levels, global levels, like the global summits, all the way down to local institutions, like in the village where I work in India, the local committees. So this diversity of institutions, I think, is what we're seeing emerge, and hopefully taking us on a path to sustainability. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, yes, I'm an optimist about human learning. The learning based on the concept of the Anthropocene, I think is currently very fast. Colleagues, if you don't raise your hand, I continue to engage Ruth in a one-on-one discussion. I see Jan, but let me add one comment which you may like to come back later to, Ruth. In what context does ethics come into your consideration? When we look with the wisdom at hindsight on the Green Revolution in India, we would all quickly agree that it should have been designed differently. With the wisdom of the then present, I'm not so sure whether we had a solution on hand to deal with the massive hunger situation that was unfolding. So, but that's, I don't want to belabor the case of Green Revolution with hindsight or with present side 50 years ago, but human beings have ethical considerations related to protect the poor and survival, and which come in a harsh situation in the current pandemic. So maybe later in closing this session, come back to that, but let's listen to Jan now.
No, I didn't want to postpone the ethical discussion here, but I had one add-on to the discussion you started about. I think I heard the word governance in that, and that relates to the question of scale. So Elinor Ostrom's work was mostly on, cooperation between individuals, and now we're of course having to move to cooperation across states, and which is kind of a different beast. Do you still see nature's rules applicable to that level of cooperation, or could you provide any insights on what we can expect on that front as pandemics and other global risks hit us?
Yeah, thanks for that. I just want to make a comment about the Green Revolution, because it pulled a lot of poor farmers out of poverty, and we don't see the kinds of famines that occurred earlier. So it has a lot. I'm not one who just bashes the Green Revolution. I think the issue was not so much as the Green Revolution, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, but the ability to self-correct. That when these problems became clear, like depletion of groundwater, over-reliance on agrochemicals, inequitable distribution, loss of the nutritious cereals, when all those problems started to be, you can't know all of the consequences of a big change. So I don't fault the Green Revolution, but how can we build these mechanisms that when the problems become apparent, there's a way to compensate them and correct for them. So I think that's kind of our Green Revolution lesson, is that at the beginning, not building in what people would call adaptive management.
Yeah.
And Jan, the idea of the world is very different than the sort of local communities that Elinor Ostrom studied for forestry and fisheries management, and she was the first to recognize that, and she wrote a lot towards the end of her life about this polycentric governance and the linkages between different scales of governance. For me, what I take away is how do we think about when are top-down command and control kinds of investments needed? For instance, like investing in development of a vaccine. That's a very top-down sort of thing that needs function. And when is bottom-up strategies, which follow Elinor Ostrom's, satisfy her design principles, when is that an effective strategy? So I don't know if I should say this because I don't know if it's true, but sometimes I think in the US, you all know how crazy it's been here with people not wearing masks and just being, totally well, how you've heard those stories. And if there had been a more bottom-up kind of strategy where local communities had the right had information, not politically tainted, and could come to their own rules about how to control their behavior, would we have come to a different outcome? So it's that kind of leadership that can think about what are the top-down needs and what can be achieved by enabling bottom-up, kind of self-organized. So I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but I've been trying to think about that also, because clearly we can't have a completely bottom-up world where every local community manages itself. That's not the world we live in. But how to combine those lessons and use them when they apply for a situation.
I think it's a beautiful answer, Ruth. Maybe we are just institutionally having too much hindering forces that stand in the way of fast institutional innovations. If we look at decentralization of government, in the last 30 years, virtually all developing countries have added 1 or even 2 layers of decentralization for their government, governmental organization. In India, you're of course familiar with the Panchayat change, which was so fundamental. So I see this as a worldwide trend, which we studied a bit at CEF, but maybe it needs to go much further and have not only district boundaries, but ecological considerations in mind. I see a hand is up by Irene. Irene, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth, for a very nice presentation. I'm just thinking about the bottom-up approach, still just following up on Jean Bonn. Much has been done to decentralize, just like Professor von Braun has mentioned, to decentralize governance or decision-making. I come from the environment field, and getting communities to drive, for instance, restoration from the grassroots is really, has proven to be successful, but there are external factors that still do not allow this approach to move to scale. So do you have any ideas of, because the power dynamics, when the resources grow, power, those who are at the top want to now control. When the communities have the choice, they are able to address the challenges and can work within their confines, things are okay. But when it starts becoming of interest, when it starts attracting, more return on investment, dynamics change. I don't know whether you have some insights on how to manage this balance.
Yeah, thank you for that, Irene. Absolutely. So I see that same in our work in central India, that same community engagement with restoration. But I also see elite capture and corruption, and how do you wow, that's the $1 million question is how do you counter that kind of elite capture which will come in. So some of Eleanor Ostram's principles address that in terms of the design principles that need to be in place to be able to have this kind of self-organization and not be corrupted. And those relate to having access to information and having authority to enforce. And when I see these kinds of elite capture examples that I know about just at a village level, it's a lot of it is because, well, people lack access to information, which makes them unable to respond. But there's also just, such legacy of feudalism and colonialism, and it's such a hard question. And I know access to information alone won't solve the problems of corruption and elite capture, but I think it can help, at least empower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Ruth, you gave us a very enlightening seminar, a wonderful talk, rooted in excellent research. I recognize that as you started out, the world is unpredictable, but that also has an upside, which is that there are possibilities and probabilities. such as that you finally will fly over to Frankfurt and visit Bonn. That's a real possibility for which we look forward to. We want to maintain this contact with you. I personally also in relation to the Food Systems Summit and its follow-up and so on. Would you care to say a few closing remarks on the ethics question?
Oh. Well, when I was writing this book, this ethics question was front and center in my mind because I did not want to give the impression that that humans are like nature, because humans have ethics. We take care of our sick and non-productive members of society. We care about equity. These are not sort of functions that nature is not intentional, but it's not what evolution rewards. So these strategies give us ideas about what we might learn and implement in our human institutions, but they're not a roadmap for what I didn't want to do was be prescriptive and give the idea that we should do this or we shouldn't do that, or be very prescriptive, particularly at an individual level, like people shouldn't eat meat. I didn't want to get at that kind of prescriptive level, but to give ideas, knowing that that we have ethics. How might these strategies be in our consciousness about ones that have worked for nature through billions of years of trial and error, and what we might learn from them, because we go through our same process of trial and error, and we could learn a lot and sort of jumpstart our own thinking about the strategies that we might use in our human institutions. For example, as the question was, what's the right balance between the cost of redundancy and the benefit? So using these strategies to ask ourselves those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I will look very much forward to when we can talk to each other face to face and share ideas, and hopefully that time is not too far in the future.
Thank you so much. And if it's too far in the future, we continue with these technologies. Thank you again. Thank you all very much for participation. You had a great audience, great questions, wonderful conversation with you. Best wishes to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad the third time we were able to be together.